The grand chandelier cast a golden glow over the marble floors of the office lobby, where Emily, the janitor, stood frozen, her mop still dripping with soapy water. She had just answered a lost tourist in fluent French, her voice soft but confident, when Michael, the CEO, turned his head sharply, his polished shoes halting mid-step. He had been rushing through the lobby with a map in hand, but now his eyes locked on her, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face as he overheard her switch effortlessly to Spanish for another guest, her ninth language that evening. The air grew thick with tension as he approached her, his expression unreadable, while the entire office staff held their breath, sensing something extraordinary was about to unfold. The office of Pinnacle Innovations was a place of glass walls and whispered ambitions, where every employee moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. It was late on a Friday evening, the kind of evening where the city outside buzzed with the promise of weekend freedom. But inside, the air was heavy with the weight of deadlines and unspoken expectations. Emily had worked there for 3 years, her presence as constant as the hum of the air conditioning. She was the janitor, the woman who slipped through the corridors with a quiet grace, her blue uniform blending into the background of the corporate world. Her hands, calloused from years of scrubbing floors and polishing desks, moved with a rhythm that spoke of routine, but her eyes held a depth that no one had ever bothered to notice. She was invisible to most, a shadow who cleaned up the messes left behind by those who chased success under fluorescent lights. Emily had grown accustomed to the silence of her role. She arrived each evening as the sun dipped below the skyline, her scarf wrapped tightly around her head, a small barrier between her and the world that overlooked her. She would nod politely to the security guard, a kind man named Thomas, who always offered her a warm smile and a cup of coffee from his thermos. The coffee was bitter, but it warmed her hands, and she appreciated the gesture more than she could ever say. As she pushed her cleaning cart through the empty hallways, the scent of lemon disinfectant trailing behind her, she often hummed softly to herself, melodies from her childhood, songs her mother used to sing in a tiny kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh bread. Those memories were her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the monotony of her days and the ache in her bones after hours of bending and lifting. That evening, though, was different. The office was buzzing with an unusual energy. A group of international clients had arrived earlier in the day, their voices a symphony of accents that echoed through the open-plan workspace. Emily had watched from the corner of her eye as they shook hands with the executives, their laughter loud and their gestures wide. She didn't think much of it. Her job was to clean, not to mingle. But as she mopped the lobby floor, a young woman approached her, her face flushed with panic. She was a tourist, lost in the maze of the city, and she had wandered into the building seeking directions. Her words tumbled out in rapid French, her hands clutching a crumpled map. Emily set her mop aside, her movements slow and deliberate, and responded in the same language, her voice steady and reassuring. She pointed to the map, tracing a route with her finger, and the woman's face lit up with gratitude before she hurried off into the night. It was then that Emily felt the weight of eyes on her. She turned slightly, her heart quickening, and saw Michael, the CEO, standing a few feet away. He was a tall man, his presence commanding even in the casual way he held himself, his dark coat draped over his shoulders like a cloak. Michael had been at Pinnacle for a decade, a leader known for his sharp mind and sharper temper. He was the kind of man who could silence a room with a single glance, but he also had a reputation for fairness, for seeing potential where others saw none. That evening, he had been on his way to a late meeting, his mind preoccupied with contracts and numbers, when he heard Emily's voice. It wasn't just the French that caught his attention. It was the way she spoke, the fluency that seemed to come from a place deeper than mere practice. He watched as she turned to another guest, an older man who spoke in halting Spanish, and answered him with the same ease, her words flowing like a river. Michael's curiosity turned to astonishment as he counted the languages she used. French, Spanish, then Italian for a delivery man who had wandered in with a package, followed by Mandarin for a client who had lingered after the meeting. By the time she switched to Arabic to help a maintenance worker with a broken machine, Michael had lost count. He stood there, the map in his hands forgotten, as a memory stirred in the back of his mind. He thought of his own childhood, of the small apartment where his grandmother had taught him to read, her hands trembling with age but her voice steady as she spoke in her native tongue. She had been a teacher, a woman who believed in the power of words to bridge worlds, and she had always told him that true intelligence was often hidden in the quietest corners. Emily, oblivious to the storm brewing in Michael's mind, continued her work. She wiped down a glass table, the reflection of the chandelier dancing across its surface, and tried to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. She wasn't used to being noticed, and the intensity of Michael's gaze made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through her carefully constructed walls. She had learned to keep her talents hidden over the years, a habit born from necessity. Growing up, she had been the child who sat at the back of the classroom, her hand rarely raised, because every time she spoke, her classmates would stare, some with awe, others with resentment. She had taught herself 9 languages, not for praise, but for survival. Her parents had been immigrants, their lives a patchwork of odd jobs and late nights, and Emily had learned early on that knowing the right words could mean the difference between a meal and an empty stomach. As Michael approached her, the lobby seemed to hold its breath. The other employees, who had been lingering near the reception desk, turned to watch, their curiosity piqued by the unusual scene unfolding before them. Emily straightened, her hands gripping the handle of her mop, and met Michael's gaze. His eyes were searching, not with judgment, but with something she couldn't quite place, something that made her heart pound even harder. He stopped a few steps away, his voice low but clear, cutting through the hum of the room. He asked her a question, simple but loaded with meaning, and her answer would change everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. The lobby of Pinnacle Innovations seemed to shrink under the weight of that single moment, the golden light from the chandelier flickering as if it too held its breath. Michael stood before Emily, his tall frame casting a shadow that stretched across the polished floor, his dark coat swaying slightly with the movement of his hands as he folded the map with deliberate care. His eyes, usually so focused on balance sheets and boardroom strategies, now held a spark of something raw, curiosity mixed with a quiet awe that softened the hard lines of his face. Emily clutched her mop handle tighter, her knuckles whitening under the pressure, the scent of lemon disinfectant still lingering in the air as she tried to steady herself. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, their whispers like a gentle rustle of leaves, and the knot in her stomach tightened into a tangle of nerves and pride she hadn't known she carried. Michael's voice broke the silence, low and measured, carrying the authority of a man used to commanding rooms but tinged with a vulnerability that caught Emily off guard. "You speak French?" he asked, his tone more a statement than a question, as if he were testing the reality of what he'd just witnessed. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications, and Emily felt a flush creep up her neck, her scarf suddenly feeling too tight against her skin. She hesitated, her mind racing back to 1,000 moments where she'd hidden her gifts, tucking them away like treasures in a locked chest, because standing out had always come with a cost. But the way Michael looked at her, his gaze steady and searching, urged her to respond. She took a shallow breath, the taste of the room's stale air mixing with the faint bitterness of Thomas's coffee still on her tongue, and nodded. "Yes," she said softly, her voice trembling at first but growing firmer. "And 8 others." The admission felt like a confession, a secret she'd guarded for years spilling into the open, and the lobby seemed to tilt as the weight of it settled. Michael's eyebrows lifted, a rare crack in his composed demeanor, and for a moment, he looked almost boyish, his mind clearly racing to catch up with what she'd said. The staff around them shifted, their curiosity morphing into murmurs that rippled through the space like waves against a shore. Emily's heart pounded, the sound of it loud in her ears, as she braced herself for the judgment she'd always feared. Would they see her as an oddity, a janitor who didn't belong in their polished world? But Michael didn't recoil. Instead, he stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy and sharp, reaching her as he studied her with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in years. He asked her to name them, his voice gentle now, as if he were coaxing a shy child to share a story. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry, and began to list the languages that had shaped her life. French, Spanish, Italian, Mandarin, Arabic, German, Russian, Portuguese, and Swahili. Each word rolled off her tongue with a rhythm that felt like a song, a melody woven from the nights she'd spent hunched over dictionaries by candlelight, teaching herself through the voices of old radio broadcasts and the kindness of strangers in her neighborhood. Her parents had been her first teachers, their broken English a bridge to a new life, but it was her own hunger for understanding that had driven her further. She spoke of how she'd learned Mandarin from a neighbor who cooked dumplings in her kitchen, how Arabic had come from a shopkeeper who shared stories of his homeland over cups of sweet tea. Each language was a thread in the tapestry of her identity, and as she spoke, the room seemed to expand, the walls fading into the background. Michael listened, his expression shifting from surprise to something deeper. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. He thought of his grandmother again, her frail hands guiding his own as she taught him the Cyrillic alphabet, her voice a lifeline during the years his family struggled to make ends meet. He had climbed the corporate ladder with that same determination, but he'd never imagined finding such a kindred spirit in the quiet janitor who cleaned his office. The memory of her lessons stirred a longing he hadn't felt in years, a reminder of the value of knowledge beyond profit margins. He looked at Emily, her dark eyes reflecting the chandelier's light, and saw not just a worker but a woman who had built a world within herself, a world he suddenly wanted to understand. The staff watched, their murmurs growing louder, some with envy, others with admiration. Thomas, the security guard, leaned against the desk, his coffee cup forgotten, a proud smile tugging at his lips. He'd always known there was more to Emily than met the eye, but not everyone was so welcoming. A few executives exchanged glances, their faces tightening with discomfort. To them, Emily was a disruption, a reminder of the hierarchies they clung to, and the thought of a janitor outshining them in skill gnawed at their pride. The air grew thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm, and Emily felt it like a weight on her chest. She wanted to shrink back, to grab her cart and disappear into the shadows, but Michael's presence anchored her. He turned to the room, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Everyone listen up," he said, his tone firm but not harsh, drawing every eye to him. He gestured toward Emily, his hand steady, and continued, "This woman has a gift that puts many of us to shame. 9 languages, learned through grit and passion, while she keeps this place running." The words hung in the air, bold and unapologetic, and for a moment, the lobby fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. Emily's breath caught, her hands trembling as she realized what he was doing. He was lifting her up, giving her a voice in a world that had silenced her for so long. The weight of his words sank into her bones, a mix of gratitude and fear, because with recognition came vulnerability, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what might come next. Michael's next move was unexpected, a decision born from instinct rather than calculation. He stepped back, his eyes still on Emily, and announced that he wanted her in his office the next morning. Not to clean, but to talk. The room erupted, a cacophony of gasps and whispers, the staff stunned by the shift in power dynamics. To them, it was unthinkable, a CEO inviting a janitor into the inner sanctum of decision-making. But to Michael, it felt right, a chance to honor the potential he saw in her, a potential buried under years of invisibility. Emily stood rooted to the spot, her mind spinning with possibilities, the mop still in her hands, a symbol of the life she'd known, now teetering on the edge of transformation. The night stretched on, the city lights twinkling through the glass, and as she watched Michael walk away, she felt the first stirrings of hope, a fragile, flickering thing that promised to change everything. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Pinnacle Innovations, casting long, golden streaks across the marble floors that Emily had scrubbed the night before. She stood outside Michael's office on the top floor, her cleaning cart abandoned in the basement for the first time in years, replaced by a nervous energy that buzzed through her like a live wire. Her blue uniform felt out of place in the executive suite, where the air smelled of polished wood and expensive coffee, a stark contrast to the lemony tang of her usual workspace. She adjusted her scarf with trembling fingers, the fabric soft against her skin, but unable to calm the storm inside her. The events of the previous evening played in her mind like a film reel. The way Michael's voice had silenced the lobby, the weight of his words lifting her up in front of everyone, and the stunned faces of the staff as he invited her here. She had barely slept, her small apartment filled with the creak of floorboards as she paced, her heart torn between fear and a fragile hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. The door to Michael's office was heavy, made of dark oak with a brass nameplate that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle, the cool metal a sharp contrast to the warmth of her palm. She could hear the faint murmur of voices inside, a reminder that this wasn't just a meeting. It was a crossing of worlds, a step into a space where she had never belonged. Her mind flashed back to her childhood, to the cramped living room where her parents had sat her down after a long day of work, their faces etched with exhaustion but their voices firm. They had told her to keep her head down, to work hard and stay quiet, because the world didn't always reward those who stood out. That lesson had kept her safe, but it had also kept her small. And now, standing on the threshold of Michael's office, she felt the weight of their words colliding with the possibility of something more. She knocked softly, the sound barely audible, but the door swung open almost immediately, revealing Michael seated behind a wide desk cluttered with papers and a steaming mug of coffee. He looked up, his face breaking into a small, genuine smile that softened the sharp edges of his features. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a sign of the long hours he'd already put in that morning. The office itself was a study in contrasts. Modern glass walls on one side, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline, and shelves lined with old books on the other, their spines worn from years of use. The scent of leather and ink filled the air, mingling with the faint bitterness of coffee, and Emily felt a pang of longing for the simplicity of her cleaning routine, where the world made sense. Michael gestured for her to sit, his movements easy but purposeful, and Emily lowered herself into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The leather creaked beneath her, the sound loud in the quiet room, and she couldn't help but notice the way the morning light caught the flecks of gray in Michael's hair, a reminder of the years he'd spent building this company from the ground up. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, and studied her with the same intensity she'd seen in the lobby the night before. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet curiosity that made her feel both exposed and understood, a combination that left her breathless. He spoke first, his voice warm but direct, asking her to tell him more about her languages, about how she'd learned them, and what they meant to her. Emily took a deep breath, the air cool against her dry throat, and began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, hesitant, but it grew steadier as she wove the story of her life through the languages that had shaped it. She told him about French, the first language she'd learned beyond her parents' native tongue, taught to her by a librarian who had taken pity on a lonely girl hiding in the stacks after school. She spoke of Mandarin, learned through late-night conversations with Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived next door and shared stories of her village in China while they folded dumplings together on a rickety table. Each language was a doorway to a memory, a piece of her past that she had carried with her like a talisman, and as she spoke, the room seemed to fade away, replaced by the vivid colors of those moments. The amber glow of the library, the steam rising from Mrs. Chen's kitchen, the sound of her father's laughter as he taught her Arabic phrases under a flickering bulb. Michael listened without interruption, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes never leaving her face. He could feel the weight of her words, the resilience woven into every sentence, and it stirred something deep within him. A memory of his own struggles, of the nights he'd stayed up studying while his mother worked double shifts to keep the lights on. He had always prided himself on recognizing talent, on building a company where innovation thrived, but he realized now how blind he'd been to the potential right in front of him. Emily wasn't just a janitor. She was a scholar, a survivor, a woman who had built a universe of knowledge within herself despite the world's indifference. The realization hit him like a wave, and he felt a pang of guilt for the years she'd spent unseen, her gifts buried under the weight of a mop and a uniform. As Emily finished speaking, her voice trailing off into a quiet pause, Michael leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking again, and let out a slow breath. The city outside buzzed with the hum of traffic, a distant reminder of the world moving on. But inside the office, time seemed to stand still. He thought about the company, about the rigid structures that kept people like Emily in their place, and he felt a spark of determination ignite within him. He had the power to change that, to rewrite the rules, and he wanted to start with her. He asked her what she wanted, what she dreamed of, his voice gentle but firm, and the question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before, and the weight of it settled into her chest, heavy and warm, like a stone smoothed by a river. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble of fear and longing. She thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they'd made, and the way they'd always told her to be grateful for what she had. But she also thought of the nights she'd spent dreaming of more, of a life where her languages could open doors, where she could teach or travel or simply be seen for who she was. She looked at Michael, his face open and waiting, and felt a flicker of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She told him she wanted to learn, to grow, to use her languages to connect people, to make a difference in a way she never could with a mop in her hand. The words felt bold, almost reckless, but they were true, and as they hung in the air, she saw something shift in Michael's expression. A decision forming, a plan taking shape, one that would ripple through the company and beyond. Since we're on page 3 and you've requested the second last page, I'll assume this means you'd like page 4 to be the second to last page, with page 5 as the final one. I'll proceed with page 4 now and wait for your instruction to write the final page. Let me know if I've misunderstood. The air in Michael's office seemed to thicken with the weight of Emily's words, her quiet confession hanging between them like a fragile thread stretched taut. She sat across from him, her hands still clasped in her lap, the blue of her uniform a stark contrast against the rich leather of the chair, and her eyes held a mixture of vulnerability and resolve that made Michael pause. The city skyline stretched out beyond the glass walls, a patchwork of steel and sunlight, but inside, the world felt smaller, more intimate, as if the two of them were the only ones who existed in that moment. Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, the faint scent of his coffee mingling with the polished wood of the room, and he felt a surge of responsibility. Not just as a CEO, but as a man who had been given a chance to right a wrong that had gone unnoticed for too long. He thought about Pinnacle Innovations, the company he had poured his life into, a place where success was measured in numbers and innovation was celebrated in boardrooms, but where someone like Emily had been overlooked for years. The realization stung, a sharp prick of guilt that settled in his chest, because he knew he was part of the system that had kept her invisible. He remembered the early days of the company, the late nights spent dreaming of a place where talent could thrive, where people could rise above their circumstances. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, her words a gentle reprimand. She had always believed in the power of knowledge, in the quiet strength of those who carried the world on their shoulders without ever asking for recognition. Emily was one of those people, and Michael knew he couldn't let her fade back into the shadows. Emily watched him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it, the rhythm echoing the nervous flutter in her chest. She had never spoken so openly about her dreams, not even to her parents, who had always prioritized survival over ambition. The memory of her father's hands, rough from years of manual labor, flashed through her mind. How he'd held her face as a child and told her to be careful, to protect herself from a world that didn't always welcome people like them. But Michael's question had cracked something open inside her, a longing she had buried under layers of practicality, and now that it was out, she couldn't push it back down. The room felt warm, the sunlight streaming through the window brushing against her skin like a gentle touch, and she wondered if this was what it felt like to be truly seen. Michael stood, his movements deliberate, and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out at the city. The hum of traffic was a distant murmur, a reminder of the world moving on, but he was focused on the woman behind him, on the potential he saw in her. He turned back to her, his face set with a determination that made her breath catch, and told her he had an idea. Not just a gesture, but a real opportunity. He wanted to create a role for her, something new, something that would use her languages to bridge gaps within the company and beyond. Pinnacle had clients all over the world, he explained, his voice steady but tinged with excitement, and they often struggled with communication, with understanding the nuances of culture and language that could make or break a deal. Emily, with her gift, could be the key to unlocking those connections, to building relationships that went beyond contracts and profit margins. The words hit Emily like a wave, crashing over her with a force that left her dizzy. She had spent so long dreaming of a life where her languages mattered, where they could be more than a survival tool, but she had never imagined it could happen here, in the very place where she'd scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. Her mind raced, images flashing before her. The faces of the people who had taught her, the late nights spent memorizing verbs and phrases, the quiet pride she felt every time she helped someone understand. But with the excitement came a flicker of fear, a shadow that crept into her thoughts like a cold wind. What if she failed? What if she couldn't live up to the expectations, couldn't navigate the world of executives and boardrooms? She thought of the staff downstairs, the ones who had whispered behind her back the night before, their envy a sharp blade she could still feel. Would they accept her, or would they see her as an intruder, a janitor playing at something she didn't deserve? Michael seemed to sense her hesitation, because he sat back down, his eyes softening as he leaned toward her. He told her he believed in her, that he had seen the way she carried herself, the quiet strength that had kept her going through years of invisibility. He spoke of his own journey, of the doubts he'd faced when he started Pinnacle, the nights he'd lain awake wondering if he was enough. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest at the vulnerability he shared, a glimpse into the man behind the title. He told her that change was never easy, that there would be challenges, but that he would stand by her, that she wouldn't have to face them alone. The words were a lifeline, a promise that made the fear in her heart shrink just a little, replaced by a tentative hope that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. She thought of her mother, of the way she'd smiled through exhaustion, her hands kneading dough for the bread they sold at the market to make ends meet. She thought of her father, of the pride in his eyes when she'd spoken her first full sentence in English, a milestone that had felt like a victory for their whole family. They had sacrificed so much to give her a chance at a better life. And now, sitting in this office with the city sprawling out below, she felt the weight of their dreams resting on her shoulders. She wanted to make them proud, to honor the lessons they'd taught her, but she also wanted to honor herself, to step into the light she had shied away from for so long. As Michael began to outline the details of the role, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her thoughts, Emily felt the first stirrings of a new chapter, one that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The days following Emily's meeting with Michael unfolded like a dream she was afraid to wake from, each moment tinged with a surreal brightness that made the world around her feel sharper, more vivid. The executive suite at Pinnacle Innovations, once a distant realm she'd only glimpsed while cleaning, became her new reality as she stepped into the role Michael had envisioned for her. A cultural liaison, a bridge between languages and people, a voice for the global clients who walked through the company's doors. The office buzzed with a new energy, the hum of keyboards and murmured conversations now interspersed with the sound of Emily's voice, steady and warm, as she translated documents, guided meetings, and shared stories that brought distant cultures to life. Her blue janitor's uniform was gone, replaced by a simple blazer and skirt that felt foreign against her skin. But the scarf she wore remained, a quiet nod to the woman she'd always been, even as she stepped into the woman she was becoming. Michael kept his promise, standing by her as she navigated this uncharted territory, his presence a steady anchor in the whirlwind of change. He introduced her to the team with a pride that made her chest ache, his words painting her not as a former janitor, but as a vital part of Pinnacle's future. The staff's reactions were a mixed tapestry. Thomas, the security guard, beamed at her from his post, his coffee cup raised in a silent toast every time she passed, while others, like the executives who had once whispered behind her back, offered tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Emily felt their skepticism like a weight on her shoulders, a reminder of the divide that still lingered, but she also felt the warmth of those who embraced her, the junior staff who sought her out for help with translations, their gratitude a balm to the doubts that sometimes crept in during the quiet hours of the night. Her new office was a small space on the 10th floor, a far cry from the broom closet she'd once stored her cleaning supplies in, but to Emily, it felt like a palace. The desk was simple, cluttered with notebooks and a laptop she was still learning to use, and the window offered a view of the city that stretched out like a promise. She would sit there in the early mornings, the scent of fresh coffee from the break room mingling with the crisp air that seeped through the glass, and she'd think of her parents, her father's quiet strength, her mother's unwavering love, and the sacrifices they'd made to give her this chance. She had called them the night after her first day in the new role, her voice trembling as she told them everything, and the sound of her mother's tears through the phone had been a melody of joy and pride that Emily knew she'd carry with her always. They had told her they'd known she was destined for more, that her languages were a gift meant to be shared, and their words had settled into her heart like a foundation she could build on. Emily's work began to ripple through the company in ways she hadn't anticipated. A client from Brazil, who had once walked away from a deal due to miscommunication, returned after a meeting where Emily translated not just his words but the emotion behind them, her Portuguese capturing the warmth of his intentions. A team in Japan sent a letter of thanks after she helped navigate a cultural misunderstanding that had threatened a partnership, her careful explanation of traditions turning tension into trust. Each success felt like a small victory, a brick in the wall of confidence she was building, but it wasn't without struggle. There were days when the pressure weighed heavily, when a mistranslated phrase or a skeptical glance from a senior executive made her question if she belonged. On those days, she'd walk down to the lobby during her break, the marble floors still gleaming from the hands of the new janitor, and she'd remember the nights she'd spent there, invisible but resilient, and she'd find the strength to keep going. Michael watched her transformation with a quiet satisfaction, his own perspective shifting as he saw the company through her eyes. He began to notice the others who had been overlooked, the receptionist with a knack for problem-solving, the intern who sketched designs in his notebook during lunch, and he realized that Pinnacle's true strength lay not in its profits but in its people. He started a mentorship program, inspired by Emily's journey, giving others a chance to rise, and the office began to feel less like a machine and more like a community, a place where stories were shared over coffee and potential was nurtured rather than ignored. He thought often of his grandmother, of the lessons she'd taught him about the power of words, and he felt a peace he hadn't known he'd been searching for, a sense that he was honoring her legacy in a way he never could have in the boardroom alone. For Emily, the greatest change was within herself. She stood taller now, her voice steady as she spoke in meetings, her laughter a little louder as she shared lunch with colleagues who had become friends. She still carried the weight of her past, the calluses on her hands a reminder of the years she'd spent scrubbing floors, but she no longer saw them as a mark of limitation. They were a testament to her strength, to the journey that had brought her here. The city outside her window glittered with possibility, its lights a constellation of dreams she was finally brave enough to chase. And as she looked out at it one evening, the sky streaked with the colors of dusk, she felt a gratitude so deep it brought tears to her eyes. She had found her place, not just in Pinnacle but in the world. A place where her languages were a bridge, her store,